Yeah, so there's a link to the Etherpad in Hangouts. I just pasted that.
I just rechatted it to Charlotte.
Yeah, I found it. It was in the other calendar.
Oh, okay.
I didn't stop on
We'll get the calendaring stuff right next time.
Yeah,
It's okay.
it's tricky. I'm not very good at organizing. So yeah, there are a few areas, possible areas of focus outlined in the Etherpad. We don't have to stick to that at all. It's more just to sort of organize a few different prompts to get the discussion going. So I can go over those in a second. And then we'll basically start the conversation after sort of building off of those prompts. Maybe get the brain flowing with, where testing pain is. So I kind of started high level at product development. I just wanted to put the prompt out there that is code quality emphasized in product development and product design cycles. So at first, when I had written this, I had just put quality, not code quality. And I think it's important to differentiate the two by saying that quality is something that, product quality is something you sort of consider as a user-facing quality. In that it's really, how well it functions to the user, which is super important, but I think also code quality is important with respect to testing, especially in that code quality means well-structured code, modular code, something that you can sort of go back to and refactor later without a whole lot of subsequent pain. And also, well-structured code is usually easier to test, I think. So I think that's an important prompt to put there. Oh yeah, and feel free, like anybody, of course this is an Etherpad, so it kind of goes without saying, you can pretty much just destroy this thing however you want it. This kind of like the idea here is that it's supposed to be just an organic conversation. Anybody can chime in whenever they want. Project management, so going down a level, like on the actual operational quarter to quarter, week to week, day to day workflow, do you feel like there's room for testing in that? Do you feel like you're being pushed to meet deadlines to the extent that you maybe don't have testing integrated into your daily workflow? And by integrated, I mean sort of, I think TDD would be probably the most extreme version of integrated testing, right? So that you're doing red-green refactoring or something like that. I'm not saying that that's like the highest, what you should be aspiring to, but it's just sort of to sort of measure how well integrated testing is. That would be probably the most extreme. Or do you go back maybe at the end of the week and do like a testing session, run all your browser tests or things like that, or have exploratory testers help you out in that regard. And then does it run with your cadence or does it run counter to your cadence? Do you feel like you're stopping, you're like losing momentum when you go to test? Or is it really something that's sort of, yeah, like I said, totally integrated into the way that you work? And then to go beyond that, down a level again, writing tests, the actual day-to-day engineering aspect of it. What kind of tests do you focus on? Do you focus more on unit testing, integration, acceptance testing, or end-to-end, going from sort of most granular level of testing to most broad and system-focused? Do you feel that your code is testable at all levels? Do you feel like you could write unit tests easily? Or is it, are your frameworks or platforms that you're working on, do they not accommodate that well? And then are the tools and frameworks available and well documented? Do you feel like you can just take the browser test framework and get going? Does it make sense to you? Does the language it's written in, is that like a big barrier to entry? And then is there like high level exemplary documentation as well? And then running tests. So now, after writing tests and getting good coverage in your code, do you feel like that becomes a maintenance burden to you possibly? Can you quickly, going back to integrating that into your workflow, can you easily and quickly run tests locally while you're developing? Do they run downstream? Do they run in continuous integration, for example? And what's stopping them if not? Are the failures, when they do occur, are they clear? Do you feel like you can troubleshoot them easily? Do the errors make sense to you? Or is it just sort of a black box? And then finally, do you find yourself dedicating a lot of time towards refactoring tests rather than writing main application code? And that's pretty much it. So anybody that wants to add a section, or anybody that wants to chime in about where their pain points are, let's start the conversation. And if nobody feels like starting it, I can totally start with myself and my own experience.
Possibly as a new MediaWiki developer. So I'm basically I've been learning partly through getting just sort of random some code tours from coworkers, and partly through the documentation both on MediaWiki.org and in the Wikimedia. And testing has not really been emphasized in any of those ways of learning. There's a lot. It's entirely possible that I've missed some, but I definitely see a discoverability issue, and I haven't heard that much conversation about where it fits in my coworkers' workflows and stuff like that. I know that Jenkins will run things before anything gets merged. Like, that's great, but in the sort of where is everything and how does it work, I don't actually know where the tests live. So I think that's a problem.
And what projects? Do you have a couple example projects?
I've been working a little bit on SecurePull, just as a sort of learning, getting used to MediaWiki and extensions and the code base in general. That's where I've been doing this so far.
Okay. So you feel that the call for quality and for testing isn't really made explicit. Do you feel that there's enough implicit concern about testing, or do you think it would be valuable to you to make that explicit and to really have guidance on that front about how to write tests in the domain that you're working in?
It would be valuable to have some sort of some sort of here is how we do tests.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's another good prompt to sort of to reiterate to the group too. I think just to give my own experience in testing, I've probably been doing test-driven development for not very long, maybe the last 4 years or so. And it was really painful when I started out. It was like the patterns of how to implement a good test and how to structure your code so that it's testable it took a really long time to feel like I was being productive. It felt, and I was working in Rails, so to have context with that, it's actually, Rails is known for having really good testing tools, but I still felt like it was hard to just get in the groove of writing tests first, letting them fail, and then not being freaked out when half of my unit tests broke, and actually taking the time to fix those and not just pushing it aside. So, yeah, I definitely feel like, maybe we could, for an actionable item on this, maybe a workshop would be appropriate to have some sort of what does a good test look like, something like that. So this is what we're looking for in the conversation, are ways to follow up on these pain points.
Some kind of onboarding guide, new developers, like here's how we test
Oh, yeah.
things. Like if you go to MediaWiki.org and you see like how to contribute page, it has testing as the third thing. But when you go to the link, it doesn't really, I mean, it has, I don't know, I don't learn this way, I guess. Maybe. It's like you have to dig for a lot of stuff. I guess that's just a humility thing. But
So do you think, sure, for you, like a workshop would be really valuable, or even like pairing during
oh yeah,
onboarding or something like
yeah,
that?
Oh, yeah.
Like
That'd be
mentorship. Like everybody that goes through onboarding maybe gets paired with somebody as a mentor.
that would be great. It's not really scalable for people outside the foundation, but
Yeah.
it's something.
Okay.
Just one comment from my experience is that testing is more about the culture for that particular project and the environment that development is done in. Like if you're getting feedback on the state of the tests, for example, most iOS projects don't usually have code coverage, but there was one experience I had sending a small pull request to a JavaScript library on GitHub, and my pull request came back, and I knocked the project code coverage down from like 99% to 97%. I was like, oh man, I don't want to be that guy. So then pretty much a non-issue to like, oh, well, I guess I have to write tests for the code I added because I don't want to be that guy. And that's at least what's been driving me to improve things on iOS, to at least give us some feedback about tests. Because, I mean, the state that we're in right now and have been for some time is that, you know, sometimes you write tests for things, whether or not they're good tests is not even a question. It's just we need some tests, like even if it's just, oh, test this input against that input, and this is the expected answer. And then at least getting them to run, because right now, like I'll go to write more tests, and the tests won't even compile because of the way projects are set up. You don't always build the tests when you build the app. So to me, it's more a question about the environment and feedback than it is about like onboarding and like best practices. To me, it's not so much a chicken and egg question, because I think you have to have the incentive and the culture for testing and like craftsmanship, to use a buzzword, to actually build up and then sustain the practice of testing. Yeah, not to get into like any of the like the product management and like who owns testing from more of like a holistic team, like product development standpoint, but just like on the ground in the trenches software development testing. I think that's critical.
So Brian, do you feel like that feedback is valuable in sort of building up testing behaviors? So you mentioned code coverage measurements as one possible mode of feedback. Just to sort of paraphrase and see if I'm getting this, what you're saying correctly, you feel that the tools and those sort of mechanisms for feedback will maybe gradually build up testing behaviors among team members, and maybe that is ultimately more valuable than explicit onboarding?
I think so. I think it's, and this is kind of my philosophy with other things as well, that it's got to be something, you can't just say like, this is how we write tests. It's got to be like, look at the tests that are in the repo, like kind of like our style guide. We have a dummy file in the iOS project that's just like, this is how we indent our code and all those things, or this is some of the design patterns we use. We have like a wiki for like best practices for like architecture and things like that, but ultimately it comes down to how we're actually building the app. So it's like, oh, you want to solve this problem, look how it was solved over here. Oh, you need to test some asynchronous code that does networking, look how this test was written, and like don't copy paste it, but you know, maybe build the test harness out of it so we can reuse it. And just to quickly comment on like the whole coverage thing and whether or not that's a good signal, ideally you get to the point where you're also seeing failures and actually getting the feedback that like, oh, I would have, like, this would have been a bug if it had been shipped. But also, like, my philosophy on coverage is that it's just, you know, it's better than nothing. It's kind of like your blood pressure is a good analogy that I've heard, where like if you have bad blood pressure, it's usually not a good sign, but just because you have good blood pressure doesn't mean you're like perfectly healthy. So it's good as like a starting point for metrics.
Okay, from Martin. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say similar to that, I mean, there's no punishment if your tests fail usually. I mean, at least for browser tests, like if a bunch of browser tests start failing, it's really easy to just like switch off the emails or ignore the build URL. And generally, like I think, which is what Brian was saying, is like, I mean, it's not like the done thing, like to test. There's no motivation to do it. We get like rewarded by product and designers, so that's where we get our gratification at the moment. But I feel like if we publish somewhere like what code quality was like across the organization, like if I could see the visual editor team had better code coverage than me, that would make me want to kind of write more tests. And right now there's just little kind of reward for doing that. It's just something we have to do, and a lot of repositories don't even have tests set up, which I think is crazy. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of a bit counter what Brian said about code coverage. So currently in services we have kind of an unspoken rule that if people want to write services and then put them in production, we want to see at least 80% code coverage, so that code there are tests for at least 80% of the code. And I agree that that does not mean that there are no bugs, but on the other hand, that does ensure that at least for the common cases that the service will be used, it's going to work in production right away, and we won't have problems. Also, on the other hand, it helps us greatly to understand, to reason about the code when we see the tests, because the test says, okay, if A, then B should be equals something, so that I can reason about what the service tries to do at least. It doesn't matter whether the test actually passes or not. If it passes, it means it works. And that also means that it works, if it works, let's say, in the repository in Jenkins, and it doesn't work in production, then that means that there's a problem somewhere, and we can pinpoint it much easily than otherwise. Often even without involving the original developers of the service, which I think is a great thing to do.
I guess if I could piggyback on Margot's comment, I totally agree. And what you said kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, affirms kind of my philosophy that like 80% means like at least you have some kind of baseline of functionality, and that you can reason, like you said, reason about certain aspects. But I think what you said also pinpoints another common trope of TDD fanatics, which is that, you know, like testable code means like well architected or well factored code. It's like not only is it, you know, potentially functional, but also might be easier to maintain. And I think that also like how you approach testing differs very widely based on whether you're building a new service from the ground up or trying to improve coverage for a project with a lot of legacy, like the iOS app, which is only a year old, and Wikipedia, which is 8 years old, 7. So, like your kind of mindset going into it is probably going to be quite different.
Oh, right. I mean, to be honest, I'm not a proponent of TDD, nor am I a proponent of there should be no tests. I just think that, like what you say, code quality and code refactoring is something that should be done probably with the help of something like Gerrit. So the tests should not be the end goal, nor should, let's say, people be, pushed to write tests. But it is true that if you have tests and when you keep adding new functionalities, you can still ensure that the old ones still function as you expect them to, which sometimes with large projects is rather easy to overlook, and that's important.
So just to follow up on what you guys were saying about the difference between approaching a project that has good coverage to begin with and maybe approaching a project that doesn't have good coverage, is it safe to say that those two modes of like writing tests are quite different in that maybe a project with good coverage, you're sort of you're protecting against regressions, and you're also integrating that that writing of tests sort of into your workflow, whereas going back to a project that doesn't have tests might require an initial investment in achieving coverage, and actually maybe quite a bit of investment in understanding the code to begin with. And should we have time and space to address those projects that are lacking coverage?
From my standpoint, yeah, for sure, because when you write code, one way or another, you have to test it somehow. So whether you, I don't know, issue some curl requests locally, manually, or you create a script for yourself or whatever, you still need to do some, let's say, semi-repetitive tasks in order to be sure that what you've just coded actually works. So if you start with a project that's already there but has no tests, yeah, that's a kind of a big time investment to put the tests there. But on the other hand, when you, I don't know, download the code and you want to test something, when you want to use it in one way or another, you already start testing, but you start testing manually. So you should just maybe kind of get into that testing mindset, and instead of doing that manually, start writing some procedures which can be repeated by others.
Yeah, that's basically where we're at with iOS right now, and the approach that we're sort of taking is a kind of attack it from both sides kind of approach, where you might have heard about like the testing stack or testing pyramid. We actually have a spreadsheet of manual test cases that we have run by a third-party like manual testing firm. You might have heard the Specialist Guild. I don't know if other teams are using them, but we kind of have them as like our last resort safety net before we deploy new changes to the App Store. And as we go, we're also trying to add unit tests for things as much as we can, you know, kind of refactoring as we go, both as a way to say like, okay, you know, we need to better reason about this code and understand what's going on, and also make sure that it doesn't break. And this kind of gets a little bit into the product management side of testing, where like, is testing part of like the definition of done, and how do you work that into product management cycles that incorporate like prototyping, and like when do you write tests for some code? Like Marco, I think you're saying that, you know, you just write tests from the very get-go, and I think one of the reasons tests might not get written is because people might think like, oh, like this code, like I don't know if it's gonna last, or it's too much in flux. So like the API might change, and I might basically be doubling the cost of development by developing tests at the same time as I'm writing the initial implementation. So I think a lot of people get into a pattern of, you know, write it once, you know, maybe have some manual test cases as like a high level test, and then maybe go back in and do unit tests as a way to like shore up the basic components to make them more reusable and make sure that they work.
Yeah, right, but I mean, either way, even if you change your stuff, you have to change the way you manually test it. And personally, me, what I what I do if there are no tests and I either don't have time for them or whatever reason, I usually copy paste stuff. So I have, I don't know, maybe a text document or somewhere, or a script that does that for me, and so I have to change it anyway. So the good thing is that if somebody, we were talking about onboarding here before, if somebody shows you, look, you just, I don't know, copy paste this segment of code, change the stuff for your own test, for your own test case or service, or I don't know, piece of code in general, then it's much easier than for people to adopt that style. Also, if tests are something that is wanted by other people in the project, then your patch should not get a +2 ever before that test is actually there.
So just sort of to repeat the last couple minutes of conversation back, I think, Brian, you were saying that you don't necessarily have to follow the TDD approach. Like, you don't have to write unit tests first, red, green, refactor, whatever, and then work to build higher level coverage or manual coverage. It totally depends on the team's workflow, your deadlines, and what you're asked of, and the frameworks that you're working in. And then Marco, you're saying that, again, like something in onboarding, a specific team member can maybe help you out, show you exactly, how testing is done within that team, since it is very team specific. That could be really valuable as part of the onboarding process. And I'm sort of wondering, in that respect, could we work towards some sort of onboarding template? Like, does it, I went through the onboarding process not too long ago, like a year ago, and it was quite overwhelming in the amount of information that you're taking in, because there are so many diverse MediaWiki projects that it takes you, I still feel like I don't really understand them all. I've started editing for the sake of focus. But yeah, maybe that's something we can follow up on as well. So maybe that's not something that can be done through a workshop and through specific pairing, but maybe something that we need to talk to management about and people that are dealing with onboarding. Great.
How much of that do you think would be like, it would have to be depending on the project that you're going to be working on, right? And also, I think we have to try to find ways to partition like general testing like knowledge, like if I were to go to you as a consultant and say like, how do you think I should be testing this problem, especially if it's like a higher level test, as opposed to like, how do I test like things that are asynchronous, or how do I test stuff that like, should my unit test be doing like network IO, things like that, like kind of high level best practices, and then maybe more platform specific knowledge.
Yeah, it seems like those things could be complementary. I think, workshops, I think, are a great way to disseminate that sort of knowledge, because, again, like you're going to run into patterns that are very platform specific probably, and getting people that are working on those types of platforms together in a space where they have the time dedicated towards discovering like what works best for testing seems like a really valuable approach. Again, this may be indicative of a lack of time and space in our day-to-day work, but I think there's no reason we can't promote that by finding explicit space and time to explore those ideas. So I'm curious, we've talked a lot about, and maybe this is where a lot of the pain is, and is in our workflow and in the way that we sort of educate each other. But I'm curious if anybody wants to talk about like specific tools that they've had pain with. I know the browser test framework, we've been working really hard to improve that over the last year, and I think we've made big strides. But I'm curious if anyone has like specific examples of how things have been painful, or where things seem to be getting better, or not, worse even.
I can comment briefly on the Android side. So I haven't been on the Wikimedia Android team for very long, but I have been doing Android development and Android testing for a little while. Android testing, until recently, hasn't been so well supported by Google. And what that meant was, even for kind of very simple Java models that perhaps you'd like to run a very simple unit test for, you actually had to run those on device. And it was very slow, painful, and it was difficult to build reliable tests. And to give some credibility to that statement, Google even has a Java annotation called @flakytest, which signifies that a test will be run multiple times in hopes that it will succeed at least one of those times. So we have on the Android team, we have a collection of tests. They're currently not being run on our CI system, but we're working on that. And we're excited because those testing tools provided by Google and third parties have been finally maturing, and we now have support official support for stock JUnit tests that can run on your computer, so they run quickly and they tend to be a little bit more reliable. I think our biggest pain point, though, has probably been that this has only been like kind of a recent change. So I think even the Google I/O app, which Google releases every year, I think that still doesn't have tests in it. So you look to this app and you think, I'm gonna figure out how to write apps just by inspecting this, and I don't think there's any tests in that yet. So it's still coming along, but it has made huge leaps and bounds. And right now our challenge is getting the tests to run as a prerequisite to merging code, and then kind of converting a lot of our old tests that were doing kind of wonky things just so that they would run in a semi-reliable way.
I'd like to talk to this point. So I'll introduce myself as Chase comments. I'm Baha on the Reading Web team, and we do two kinds of testing, QUnit testing and browser testing. QUnit runs really fast, probably like 30 seconds at most, and everything is great. Browser tests take longer, probably 15 minutes if things are great with Vagrant. If they're not, then longer than that. And we may, run specific browser tests, the features we worked on, and they may pass, but it's just a unit test. And if you want to emulate the integration test, then we have to run everything and see the whole system doesn't break, and that takes like 15 minutes. And that's the pain point for us in the mobile web team, Reading Web team, and I think if we can make this better, faster, then this would greatly improve our confidence and productivity, because sometimes we don't run tests and we push the code to production and then we disable tests so that they don't bother us with emails, and then fix the tests again and then push again. So multiple rounds of fixing and testing happens. So yeah, I think we are working on it. I don't think we're working on making it faster, but we are working on running tests automatically so that we know that the tests are not breaking, but we would really like some help to make the tests themselves faster, not 15 minutes.
So I'm hearing. Oh, go ahead.
So I would say, Baha, that you are lucky because you have to wait 15 minutes. Me, I can give the example of, for example, Method, which is the service that renders mathematical formulae from text. And basically what happens is that every time I'm the official deployer of that service, and every time I deploy some changes, even though we do have tests, I still have to stick around and look if people are complaining that the renderings are broken or something, simply because we emit SVGs, which if we put a new, for example, if you put a new version of the rendering library, that might mean that the formula is not aligned with the wiki text anymore or something like that. So this is not something we can test in an obvious way, and this is something I really need to talk to Dan about really soon, because we really need to find a way to actually test that the rendering has not been broken. Because I don't know if there's, let's say, I don't know if, for example, I don't know if browser tests can help there, because there is no needed functionality or user interaction there. We just want to know that the formula is aligned with the text and that it renders. And even with our tests that we have for the Mathoid service, we still cannot do that.
Yeah, go ahead. Hi, I'm Adam. I work with Fundraising Tech, and the main problem we have is that the thing we care the most about is actually our integration with third-party APIs. And so to tell if our junk is working, it seems like we're going to have to write a really complex series of mock API endpoints, which doesn't sound too fun. So if there's a cheaper way to do that, let us know.
You can always use something like Pact, which is like a replay response framework in Ruby. So you can exercise your application as you normally would through the Pact proxy, and it records the requests and responses. And then you basically turn it on replay mode, and then you run your tests against the proxy, and it just feeds you the same responses you got last time.
That's basically what we want with a little bit of parameterization. The Pact or hacked.
Yeah, that actually touches on a pretty interesting point with test patterns in general, is that once you're talking about side effects, right, like disk I/O, network I/O, things like that, touching a database, things can get a little hairy, and that's where the trade-offs really start coming into play. Is that yeah, you can either attempt to mock those things, and then you decide, at what level are you actually going to mock those things. I've had experiences with testing MediaWiki Vagrant, actually, where at first I wanted to implement a handful of actually end-to-end tests that were simulating an interactive terminal, and it would actually execute Vagrant just as somebody would in their shell. It seemed like a good way to go because it was low cost up front, but it turned out that the tests were extremely slow. Just adding a handful actually took about 1.5 minutes, which to me is still way too slow for tests. And actually, I wanted to touch on that in a second here. But yeah, it turned out that actually I found a fake FS library that would fake all the Ruby file system classes that seemed a little shady to me, but it actually ended up working pretty well. And it was a trade-off that I was ultimately willing to take because it brought the execution time down from 1.5 minutes to 1 or 2 seconds. So it was a massive difference that to me was totally worth it. And maybe again, getting people together that even hit these sort of problems in different domains can actually learn quite a bit from one another about how to go about solving them. So again, maybe that's a great topic for a specific workshop down the road. File system, network I/O, how to deal with that type of stuff. And then I wanted to talk just a second about shit. I totally forget what I was going to talk about next. So maybe let's just keep the conversation going, and it'll come back.
For API mocking, usually the API providers have some kind of sandboxes and things like that where you can issue requests without having a real impact. Can't you use those things? Sorry, the office is muted.
Yeah.
Oh,
let me know.
Good question. Those do exist, but we can't use them reliably, and one of the biggest problems is that those still require credentials. So that can't be an automated test, and also we just kind of have a principle to not call the third party during our tests, because we don't want accidents. If those credentials get substituted for real ones, then we have a giant mess.
Yeah, good point. Especially for credentials.
So I just remembered what I was thinking of a moment ago. Let me play this back to the group. So I noticed a couple different patterns in people talking about the difficulty of Android testing and also browser testing. And it seems like maybe there's a common theme, and maybe this is somewhat universal, that we could say that the feedback loop in testing, the tighter it is, the more integrated it is into your workflow, and possibly the less pain there is in finding failure down the road. And that speaks to the importance of fast tests, possibly also to the ability to run tests locally without too much pain, so that you're not developing something, getting it merged and then finding out even 24 hours later or longer, perhaps before a deployment, that your smoke tests fail or your browser tests fail or your Android tests fail. Things that you couldn't run locally. Do people think that's fair to say, that a tighter feedback loop is sort of universally more desirable if possible?
I think that's a really great point, that if your tests can't run locally, they're pretty much, or that greatly diminishes their usefulness. Like if I'm supposed to be developing in a somewhat test-driven way and I can't run them, that pretty much hamstrings whether or not I'm actually going to maintain the tests. Like if I can't run them locally and I only hear that they break after the fact, then I'm probably just going to turn them off after a while. It depends on, like you're saying, like if they take like 15 minutes or like overnight to run, like some of, I guess, like the Firefox nightly stuff, or even when I was at Spotify, they would run some tests just like continuously. It depends on your strategy, but I think once you hit, it's more a question of like having tests in the first place, and then having tests that take too long to run is usually a good problem to have. And like what you're saying as far as having frameworks that make writing the tests easy, like, oh, I have this new feature in the UI that I'm writing, or I have some new component that I'm writing. It's like it should be really, really simple and ideally documented for like how you test that thing. But yeah, like having Vagrant and all that stuff is super helpful, and being able to run even the high-level tests against a local instance is great, instead of having to wait until your code is deployed to test, which is not good.
And it sounds like speed is not just shouldn't be just a secondary priority. It should actually be a primary priority, but maybe below reliability. Is that fair to say?
I think that's valid. I mean, I think I would rather have a slow test than a flaky one. Because if it's flaky, you don't trust it.
Right. And maybe we can, I know we have tests that are just problematic to get them to run extremely fast. Just thinking about browser tests, we've tried to get to a point where we can almost run these tests in parallel. I think, we're still quite a ways off from that. But they're still inherently slow, right? We're driving a browser. There's latency between the WebDriver client and the browser itself, and then the browser is memory hungry, CPU hungry, so it's not going to, you can probably run maybe 2 or 3 browsers in parallel on both systems and get away with quite a bit of performance improvement there, but you're still cutting down, the full test suite from 15 minutes to 5 minutes at that point. Probably not even that because of switching and all that. But maybe we can explore tiered approaches to that, where we identify a handful of tests that are super important to run upon every commit. We make sure that the framework facilitates running them locally easily, and then CI is able to run those upon every commit as well. And then maybe we can figure out a way to tag tests. I see a comment about Android testing, but this could definitely apply to browser testing as well, to where we sort of differentiate the tests between broad coverage tests that we want to run before deployment, but not necessarily upon every commit, and then sort of narrow that down to ones that we want developers to be running locally before they even push a patch set. Again, I think that's really going to take time to tease out for every project, but maybe that's, again, something that we can do. Maybe pairing is actually more appropriate for that, rather than a workshop or pairing plus a workshop. I don't know.
Could I, hi, this is Chase. I just wanted to say something about the social aspect. Hopefully you can hear me. So I was at a place where we went from, I would say, really crappy testing, no coverage, to fair testing and some coverage. And I've also dealt with some upstreams that have kind of made the migration. And we started doing one thing which seems kind of insignificant, but really worked out. And that thing was that, so right now, as an example, if you upload a change set to Gerrit, typically, you have your description and you would have like reference some bug. And in general, if I go to review something and it doesn't reference a bug, I'm asking what bug it should reference because I want to go and read the context and try to understand the change. The other thing that we started doing, in addition to that, was saying you should always specify a test plan. And that didn't necessarily mean that, like, it could be anything from pasted output from a terminal of unit tests that were run to I ran this, I looked at things, and they did not look different to me, But in essence, over time, what we began to see was that people were testing the same code and the same libraries very differently. But then also, like, this one guy was running the same 3 commands to test stuff. And that was really easy to automate once we understood what people were doing over time. And then the other side effect was that eventually, if you asked someone to review something and it didn't include a test plan, it was like asking someone to review homework covered in glitter. You know what I mean? It was just really bad form. And so everybody started including a test plan, even if that test plan was really simple. And the social aspect of it basically took over, right, and went viral. And so I don't know the spectrum of testing from unit tests on up to like complex scaffolding and visual diffs. I'm not sure how that's going to work out, but the culture of like being responsible and providing a test plan, I thought the cool thing that Marco said was, everybody's testing their code, at least hopefully. But like usually when I look at a change set, I have no idea how someone tested it. And even if it's automated or not, that's kind of the first step is like, we're all testing our code. Are we testing it the same way? And if we are testing it the same way, great, now let's automate it. And if we're not, and my tests suck more than Dan's tests, then I'm going to learn from Dan, and we're going to be like, hey, we're testing this X, Y, Z. So that was kind of my introduction to this previously, going from a 0 to like maybe 75%.
Yeah, it's cool what you said about the social component of it, but in my experience so far, people are not, let's say, discussing or talking tests that much. It's more about maybe the code itself, or what it does, or what it's supposed to do, or how it does it, rather than the tests themselves. Sometimes mainly because, as you say, most of the test cases are fairly trivial. Just do that and expect X, Y, Z. But in general, yeah, I like this this idea of kind of not to be too test focused, because that also brings some kind of other problems with that, because then you maybe stop. At least in my experience, sometimes you stop looking at maybe code quality or code refactoring or whatever, but you start caring only about the tests themselves, which are just a means to an end. They're not the maybe the alpha and omega of everything.
Great, thanks, guys. Yeah, so again, it's interesting to hear that testing is sort of an incremental problem. It requires education. Whether that education is like explicit feedback, that's sort of like, the iron hammer of education. It's like, no, bad, do it the right way next time. Or maybe it's a mix of like the hammer and proper onboarding, whatever metaphor you want to use for that. I couldn't think of one. That's great. So at this point, I know a couple people probably have to leave in a few minutes, and I don't really expect this meeting to really take a full hour and a half. I'm wondering if we could move to the next phase of this, which on the agenda that is now blown out quite a bit. Let's see. We had an idea on maybe voting. Everybody that's here and in the Etherpad could possibly vote on what the next discussion, the next workshop, the next phase of this initiative should be. Because I'd love to follow up with this with something more actionable. I think this exploratory conversation is super important in teasing out like where the commonality is as far as testing and good practices goes. But I'd love to follow up with maybe a workshop, whether that's in the next month or down the road at the engineering summit or something like that. I'd love to sort of find some area of focus that we can.
So I have a suggestion. Frankly, I have no idea how other teams test stuff, how they use their tests, and nothing about that. So maybe it wouldn't be bad to, let's say, to try to see what are the commonalities between different teams in the way that they test their stuff, which frameworks they use, so that maybe we can kind of grow together a somewhat unified testing, you know, the way that testing is done at the WMF or in MediaWiki in general. Because I suppose that for sure things that are for MediaWiki and in PHP have one way of doing things, but maybe there are some, I don't know, some other projects in also using PHP but tested differently, and that kind of hardly makes any sense to me. Also, there are teams that need browser tests. There are teams that don't, but those that do need browser tests maybe should work, let's say, work together as a small, I don't know, action team or whatever to get the ball rolling, maybe for onboarding or to help others so that knowledge can be spread more easily.
Yeah, I think it would be great if we could have some kind of, I know there's been talks of like a testing team that kind of tries to embody all of the shared experience across some of the platforms, or at least the most common ones. Yeah, like Steven said, even just getting together and like we are now to talk about stuff and find our shared problems. I also think that where that group could really shine is finding either pieces of infrastructure or pieces of data that pretty much everything that works on top of Wikipedia needs. Like, it's come up several times, like having like a suite of test articles to run on, or like if you're a Wikipedia client, here are the things you should expect to support, would be super, super helpful. Like, oh, there's this one article that has formulas or weird things with image galleries and things like that. I think that would have a huge yield in terms of improved like support for the things that we expect on Wikipedia across platforms.
So that's great feedback. If I'm hearing it right, it sounds like it might be more valuable just to have follow-up discussions that are specific to like your area of development, whether that's formal, like the discussion we're having now, or in might be more valuable than sort of identifying this one unified area of focus that we should have a workshop in next. Does that sound right to everybody? And this doesn't have to be figured out now either. We can, Grace and I can maybe facilitate this after this session, and just sort of get people communicating on how to best organize these things.
Yeah, and I think there's some low-hanging fruit in here.
Yeah.
So we'll go through the notes together and see what we can do, and we'll definitely communicate anything that comes out of this.
Okay.
And it's a great discussion.
Cool.
Thanks, Dan. It was awesome.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. I guess we'll talk again soon.
Great. All right. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Stopping the broadcast. Cheers.
Ciao.